Hi everyone, in this video we will be starting with the chapter number 2 of ACCA F3, which is the cost classification. So I'll be taking 3 to 4 parts to complete this chapter because I don't want to load you all with a lot of information. We will go slow with it. It is not difficult, it is easy, but I want to cover it in a flexible amount of parts so that it is easy for you to understand. So I think I will make about 3 to 4 parts of this video. After that we will also be solving the Kaplan exam kit. In case you would like to watch the other chapters or you would like to solve the Kaplan exam kit, I have linked the playlists in the description box below, so make sure to check them out. So this chapter we'll be focusing on what exactly is cost and how do we classify the cost. Now what do you mean by cost? Every business, every firm has a product which it sells, right? A product or a service which it sells. So what is the cost of the product? How do you determine that at how much money you want to sell the product in the market? So that is something which we'll be looking in this chapter. Now first, before we begin with this, make sure you have a notebook and a pen with you and a calculator, and you need to solve the questions along with me, and you need to note down and make notes along with me. So first we'll be starting with the most important things, which is cost object, cost unit and cost center. Now what are they? Let's first see that. Before that, let's see something. Since we are the management accountants, right? So the management will require a variety of different cost summaries. So we'll be talking about how the cost can be summarized. So for example, I have a business, okay? And I have a business of clothes. I also have a business of shoes. So the price of the clothes are going to be different from the price of the shoes. So for every particular product, the cost is going to be different. So for one cost unit or for one cost object, the price is going to be different. For a paper, the price is different. For a pencil, the price is different. So according to the cost object or according to the cost unit, the price is different. Right. Costs for use in the preparation of financial reports. So when you are making financial statements of a product, obviously some money is used in that also. We'll be seeing everything in detail, don't worry. Cost for a particular department, a cost center. So sales department, production department, manufacturing department, every single department has incurred their independent costs. So every particular cost center, so cost center means that particular center, that department. It can even be something like a paper department, a paper manufacturing department, a pencil manufacturing department. So for every product you have a different department. Or for C, you remember in the business and technology paper we saw divisional versus functional. So like that, for every department a separate amount of cost expenditure has taken place. So they are referred to as the cost center. Cost to be used for decision making. To make every decision, cost is involved. Costs are useful for planning and controlling. So we'll be seeing everything. So let's begin with cost object. We have anyway discussed what cost object is, but let's just see it again in detail. A cost object is any activity for which a separate measurement of cost is undertaken. So like I told you, cost of product, cost of a service, cost of running a department, cost of running a regional office. So for every particular thing, the measurement of cost is different. That is known as a cost object. For example, if I have a books business, then one book is my cost of object, right? That is what they are referring to as the cost object. Anything which has a cost is a cost object. Absolutely anything which has a particular specific cost is known as a cost object. For example, a sales center will have a cost of its own. So I am able to measure the entire cost of a sales center. So every single thing which has a cost of its own is known as cost object. Now we come to what cost unit is. Now this is one unit of your business. So if I have a hotel business, one room is my cost object. If I'm a paint manufacturer, 1 liter of paint is my cost unit, 1 unit of my business. If I want to know for how much I will be selling one bottle, in a hospital, cost of one patient. A cost unit is a unit of product or service in relation to which costs are ascertained. Now you must be confused between cost units and cost objects. So let's quickly go and see that. A cost object is any activity for which a separate measurement of cost is undertaken. So for patient, if I have a stationery business, for my paper business cost is different. For my pencil business, my cost is different. For the sales department, I can measure cost. So anywhere where you can easily measure a separate cost, that is a cost object. But what is a cost unit? Cost unit, I cannot say that my sales department is a cost unit. No, cost unit means the operation activity business product which you are developing, the cost of that unit, that product which you are selling to the customer. You are not going to sell the sales department, right? So you cannot measure it like that. So that is the difference between cost unit and cost object. Now we have what a cost center is. A cost center is a production or a service location, function, activity, or item of equipment where costs can be ascertained. So a department, you can ascertain a cost department. You can ascertain the cost of a machine, a project, a ward. So that is what a cost center is, we have discussed. Now let's come to what a cost card is. Now there is a card which we make in order to find the cost of one unit or one product. So how do you do that? So you make a card, a cost card, using which you analyze, interpret and find out the cost of one unit. Look at this. This is an illustration of how a cost card might look. I know it is a bit taxing right now and a bit heavy, but don't worry, we'll be seeing everything in detail. This is just an overview of the chapter. So how does a cost card look? So this is a cost card for a handmade wooden train set. The cutting and assembly department, the cutting department, assembly department, painting department, they are the cost centers. One handmade wooden train set is a cost unit, right? And it can also be classed as a cost object. Very simple, self-explanatory. Now we have what direct materials are, then we have what direct labor. We will be seeing the definition, don't worry. And then we have expenses. Then we have what the prime cost is. Over that we have all this. So by doing this, in the end we come up with the total cost. This is what a cost card looks like. So what is a cost card? A cost card is used to show the breakdown of the costs of producing output based on classification of each cost. A cost card can be produced for one unit or on a planned level of production. So the following costs are brought together and recorded on the cost card. So first we'll have something which is the direct materials. We will see the definition. Direct labor, direct expenses, prime cost. So what is prime cost? Write it down somewhere. So whenever we are talking about prime cost, it is total direct cost. Total direct cost is known as the prime cost. So direct material, direct labor and direct expenses. All this when you add, you get the total prime cost, direct. Keep that in your mind. Then we have variable production overheads, fixed production overheads, non-productive overheads. We'll be going through them in a detail. Okay. Now, how are you going to classify costs? So you now saw what cost really means. You can classify this cost in various different ways. In different ways you can classify it. Now we are going to see how are we going to classify the costs. Costs can be classified in a number of ways. So the first way you can classify it is through element. What do you mean by element? What element has been used? Material element, labor element and other expenses. This is how you classify on the basis of element. So how do you classify on the basis of element? You classify the material, labor and expenses. And now you can also classify costs on the basis of nature. What do you mean by nature? What do you mean by nature? are they directly involved or indirectly involved? So are they direct cost or indirect cost? That is the nature of a cost. Next we have function. You can also classify costs on the basis of its function. So what do you mean by function? Whether are they production costs or are they non-production costs? So are we using it in production activities or are we using it in non-production activities? Production means manufacturing. What do you mean by non-production costs? Selling costs, advertising costs, stuff like that. You can, the last way or the last basis of classifying costs is the behavior. On the basis of behavior also you can classify costs. So what do you mean by behavior? How they change in relation to levels of output of activity. So with the change in the activity, with the change in the output, how does the cost behave? That is something which we will see in behavior. So these are the ways in which you can classify cost. Element. What is element? Material, labor, expense. Nature, direct, indirect. Function, production or non-production. Behavior. What is the response of cost to the relation to the change in the output or change in the activity. So these are the ways of classification of costs. That is a little bit of the overview of the classification. Now we will be seeing the one by one classification of costs. Don't worry, if you're finding it difficult right now, it's alright because we'll be seeing them in detail. Okay, so let's begin with this classification. Let's begin with classification by element. How do you classify by element? Material, labor or expenses. Classification by element. Okay, so first is material. What do you understand by material? Something which you can see, something you can feel, something you can touch. Okay, all costs of materials purchased for production or non-production activities. Raw materials, components, cleaning materials, maintenance materials. All of this is material, something you can touch and feel, right? Something which is used in the process. So those are called as materials. Now let's talk about what labor is. So material costs, all the costs which are involved in the material items are known as the material cost. What are labor costs? Labor always refers to people. Alright. So the staff, the people, the employees. So all the staff costs relating to the employees on the payroll of the organization. Those costs are always referred to the labor costs. Then we come to expenses. So the costs which are neither material costs nor labor costs, those costs come under the expenses. All other costs which are not materials or labor, this includes all brought in services, for example rent, telephones, subcontractors and costs. This is the depreciation. So these are the items which are neither material costs nor are they labor costs. So these costs are expenses. So quickly, how do you classify by element? Material, labor and expenses. After that we come to the classification by nature. What did we see when we were talking about classification of nature? We saw that the classification of nature would be either direct costs or else they are going to be the indirect costs. So what do you understand by direct costs? So direct costs are something which you can see the product and say that yeah, this must be used in the production of the product. For example, when you look at a product, when you look at a, let's say a wooden table, you know that wood is used in it. So you can look at the product and you can say that a particular thing has been used. So those are the things which have a specific purpose and which are meant for the product. They are known as the direct costs. Let's read the definition of it so that we can understand it. Direct costs are costs which can be directly identified with a specific cost unit or a cost center. So they can be directly identified. So you can easily identify the direct costs. So there are three main types of direct cost: direct material, direct labor and direct expenses. So we saw the classification by element, right? What was the classification of the element? Material, labor and expenses. Now you can further classify that into direct and indirect. So direct are those which are directly specifically used in the procedure. So let's discuss them. For example, let us take a shirt. Let us take a cost unit to be shirt, which is manufactured by a clothing company. So a shirt is my cost unit, right? So now what are the direct materials which are used in it? Something which you can look at the shirt and say, yeah, this is used in this. So you can look at a shirt and you can say that the cloth has been used in making the shirt. So the direct material would be including cloth. What do you mean by direct labors? So a particular worker who worked on stitching the cloth, so that is the wages which we are going to pay to that labor, to that worker, that is obviously going to be one of my direct labor, right? So the wages of the workers stitching the cloth to make the shirt, direct. You can look at the cloth and you can say that, yeah, one worker might have worked on this, right? Next, we have what direct expenses are. Again, thinking about what expenses are. Expenses are neither material nor labor, right? So the royalty is paid to a designer. So what do you understand by royalties paid to a designer? So when you think about it, whenever someone designs a product for you, they charge royalty from you. So it's something like per every sale, 2% of the commission is given in the form of royalty to the designer. So when you look at a shirt, you know that a designer must have designed it. The total of the direct cost is known as the prime cost. I've discussed this earlier also. So whenever you add the total of the direct cost, that is known as the prime cost. So what comes under the prime cost? Direct materials plus direct labor plus direct expenses. So when you add all of these, then you get the prime cost. Now we come to what indirect cost is. So what is indirect cost? Again, just revising, we are doing the classification on the basis of nature. What do you understand by indirect cost? Indirect cost is something which, while looking at the particular item or the cost unit, you can't say that there has been a cost. You cannot estimate it. For example, the rent of the factory. So by looking at the shirt, I can't estimate or assume that a rent has been paid for the office or the production unit, right? So that is something which is indirect. Indirect cost which cannot be directly identified with a specific cost unit or a cost center. So you can't directly look at a shirt and you won't be thinking about the rent, right? You'll be thinking about the obvious things which you can see, like the designer or the cloth and stuff like that, but you won't be thinking about the rent. You won't be thinking about the oil which has been used for the machinery which has been used to cut or something like that. So those are the indirect costs. The indirect costs associated with a shirt manufactured by a clothing material. So let's start with the indirect material which cannot be traced. So this is the basic gist of the indirect costs. You cannot really trace them, unlike the direct cost. So you cannot trace to an individual item. For example, cleaning fluids for cleaning the machinery. We just discussed that. Indirect labor, the cost of a supervisor who supervises the shirt makers. So there is a supervisor who is supervising the shirt makers, but he's not directly involved, right? He's just supervising them, but he's not directly involved. Indirect expenses, the cost of renting a factory. Again, rent of the factory. Now this is not something which I can estimate by looking at it. So the sum of the indirect costs is known as overheads. What was the sum of the direct costs? Prime cost. What is the sum of the indirect cost? Overheads. So I hope that is clear. Till now we saw the classification on the basis of nature, which is direct and indirect, and then we saw the classification on the basis of element, which was material, labor and expense. And we saw the differences between direct and the indirect cost. The sum of the direct cost is the prime cost. The sum of the indirect cost is the overheads. Okay. It is important to realize that a particular cost may sometimes be direct cost and sometimes an indirect cost. It depends on the cost object we are trying to calculate. So on the particular cost object which we have chosen, based on that we can decide whether a particular item of concern is a direct or an indirect. For example, the salary of the machining department supervisor is a direct cost of that department or cost center because it can be specifically identified with the departments. However, it is an indirect cost of each of the cost units processed in the machining department because it cannot be specifically identified. So if it's a matter of perspective, on which perspective you're seeing, on for what is the cost object in your particular thing. Based on that, you can decide whether a particular cost is a direct cost or an indirect cost. Let's quickly start with a test to understanding 1. Okay. The hire of specific tools or equipments. Think about it. Okay. Pause the video and fill it, and then you can discuss with me. I hope you're clear with it. I'll quickly just still discuss it. So the hire of specific tool. We are hiring something, so it is an expense, it is a rent to us. And is that something which we can look at the product and say, this is going to be direct. Why is it direct? Because without specific tools and equipment, you cannot produce your item. So without the tools and equipments, production of your item is impossible. So it is direct. Rent of the factory. Rent is an expense and we know that it is indirect. Supervisor's salary. Dealing with the staff. So obviously it is labor, but it is indirect since they are not directly involved. Oil for lubricating machines. We know that oil is a material, but we also know that this is indirect. We have discussed it. Wages for factory workers involved in production. So this is labor again, and this is direct because they are involved in the production process. Depreciation is always an expense and it is indirect since we cannot see it and say that by looking at the t-shirt. Again, do this, then we can discuss. Which of the following would be classified as an indirect labor? Indirect labor. Assembly workers, a store assistant in a factory storeroom, plasters in a building company, audit clerk in an accountancy firm. Alright. Audit clerk in an accountancy firm is direct labor. Why? Because auditing is the operating activity of an accountancy firm. So that is direct for them, right? So this is direct labor. Plasterers in a building company. The operating activity of making a building is plastering. So this is also direct labor. A store's assistant in factory storeroom. The purpose of a factory storeroom is storing only, right? So, but think about it for a second. A factory storeroom, store's assistant, is it direct or indirect? Are the store assistants involved in the production of the product? No, they are only storing the goods. They are not involved in producing the goods. So hence, this is the indirect labor. Now let's see the example of direct cost. Costs which can be identified with a cost center but not with a single cost unit. Costs which can be identified with a single cost unit or cost center. Costs which can be attributed to an accounting period. This is not true. This is not true. Costs which can be identified with a cost center but not with a single cost unit. This is not true. You can identify with a cost unit. Costs which can be identified with a single cost unit or cost center. So my answer is B. Why? Because this is the definition of direct cost. Okay, now let's come to the classification by functions. So what did we see when we were discussing classification by function? They are either used for production purposes or they are used for non-production purposes. So what do you mean by production purposes? Production costs are costs that relate to the manufacturing of a product or provision of a service. These costs are found in the cost of sales section of statement of P&L. Production costs such as direct materials, direct labor, direct expenses and production overheads are included in the valuation of inventory. So whatever production costs you are talking about, they are always included in the valuation of inventory. We have done this in F3, right? So what do you understand by production cost? Direct materials, direct labor, direct experience, direct expenses. So direct things are always involved with the production, right? Variable production overheads, we will see this in the future, don't worry. Fixed production overheads, even these are always involved in the production activity. Now, what are the examples of production cost? So, when we talk about, let's say, a construction company, so from the perspective of a construction company, what are its direct material? Bricks and cement, direct labor, builders, plasterers, electricians, direct expenses. So, when you talk about direct expenses, if you have basically contracted a crane and a driver, it is an expense, but it is related to your business, right? Variable production overheads, so something which keeps changing. Electricity. Fixed, site manager's salary. Don't get confused with the last two, we will be seeing this in detail. Now, what is the meaning of non-production cost? Non-production cost is basically the opposite of production costs. These are the costs which are not related to the production activities. Okay, so these are the costs which are not included in the valuation of inventory. So what do non-production costs include? Administrative cost, selling cost, distribution cost, finance cost, advertising cost is also a part of this. It comes under selling cost, but you know what I mean. So these are the kind of costs which are non-production. So these are not directly involved in the production of a good, right? So these are the things which are in the non-production costs. Now, when you talk about the example, you have administrative cost. For the administration of the business, certain costs always are incurred, right? So, for example, running the general administration departments, accounts department, selling costs, marketing costs, distribution costs, are the warehousing costs, are the delivery costs. Finance costs, what are finance costs? When the business takes a loan, the loan interest it has to pay, and the loan repayment and all of the finance costs. So these are the types of non-production costs. Let's quickly do the test to understanding 3: production, selling, distribution, administrative, finance. So we just have to classify based on this. Alright, we'll do that. Overalls for machine workers. Overalls for machine workers. So machine workers are my main people. So they are involved in the production. So 1. Cost of printer cartridges in general office. Administrative expenses, right? Salary of a factory supervisor. Supervisor. Again, what will that be? Supervisor is an expense. They have already said that it is an expense, but it will be involved in production only, right? Salary of payroll supervisor. Payroll, again, that is not related to my production, that is related to my administrative. Rent of the warehouse for storing goods. Rent of the warehouse for storing goods. So when you talk about storing, again that would be related to my distribution. So it is 3. Loan interest is my finance cost. Salary of factory security guard. So my factory is where my goods are stored. So factory, whatever salary I pay to my factory, what is going to that be? I'm sorry, I made a mistake. Salary of factory is different from salary of warehouse. So warehouse is where your goods are stored. But when we're talking about factory, factory is where the production process takes place. So whenever you talk about the factory guard, or whenever you talk about the factory security guard, it is always a production cost. But when you're talking about warehousing, it is a distribution cost. So this is 1. Early settlement discounts. Early settlement discount. Now settlement discounts, you remember what trade discount was, so that is obviously related to selling. Salary of chairman's PA. Okay, so whoever our chairman is, their personal assistant. What do you think this should be? Think about it. Obviously, 4, it is administrative expense. Road tax license for vehicles. A road tax license for delivery vehicles. Delivery is related to distribution. So, 3, bank overdraft fee, again, that is related to finance. Salesman's commission. Salesman, again, that is related to the selling cost. So, that is going to be 2. Alright, so in the next video, I'll be starting with the classification of behavior. So I hope you understood the chapter so far. It is very basic. Just read it again. Thank you.